At this time, I would like to introduce Dale Ford, Chief Analyst with the ECIA, also known as the Electronic Components Industry Association. In his presentation, Dale will share the latest ECIA research and analysis of the current state of our supply chain and how its future is likely to unfold over the coming months and years. Without further ado, Dale, take it away.
Thank you very much, Steve. It's great to join you today, and I appreciate the opportunity to share the results of some of our research at ECIA. ECIA began covering the impact of this pandemic on the electronics component supply chain back in early February, and we've continued with regular surveys of our members throughout this time frame. I will tell you at the start of this presentation that I have what I consider to be the brightest, most optimistic view of our current situation that I can report since we started these surveys. And so, as opposed to the challenging discussions that I've shared before, I'm happy to tell you, I'm giving away the end at the beginning, that I believe we have some good news to share today. So let me begin first by noting that this disaster has required a really nimble response from all participants in the supply chain. The good news is that we have learned from prior crises that have impacted the supply chain, whether it's been tsunamis and nuclear meltdowns in Japan, or it's been volcanoes in Iceland, or flooding in Thailand. All of these various, and I could go on, but all of these various disasters that we've experienced before have presented opportunities for us to learn, to improve, and create systems and processes that allow us to manage through a situation like this much more successfully. And I think we have seen the participants exhibit an incredibly resilient response to what we've gone through. Let me share some of the top line results from our surveys. This is an index that I've created from a much more detailed set of data that we've developed. But in this, what I've done is I've looked at the key stages in the electronics component supply chain, and I've created an index to look at just how concerned are participants about this stage of the supply chain. The higher the number, the greater the concern, and it goes between 0 and 100. As you will see, we've gone through a bit of a cycle in terms of where the levels of concern are at. But in the last survey that we completed in the middle of September, we saw, after a resurgence in concern in August, we saw a dramatic decline in concern on every stage of the electronics component supply chain. In fact, we registered the lowest levels of concern in terms of issues such as electronic systems manufacturing disruption. And one measure that had been stubbornly high, which was concern about loss of end market demand, for the first time saw a notable decline. And in most of the measures, we see them, the level of concern at the lowest, if not close to the lowest, if not the lowest levels during this survey period. So that's good news that I can begin with, but there's more to come. Here we look at the impact on-time delivery to customers by the distributors, by the OEMs in the supply chain. And again, this is a roll-up, and I look at how this has changed over time. So we look at the electromechanical category, the passives category, the semiconductor category. I know this is a bit of a busy chart. Just a quick review. What I've done is I've shown what did this look like in the middle of July, the middle of August, and then the final survey, the middle of September. And commenting just briefly, you'll see that electromechanical components, minimal impact, where nearly almost 50% of respondents say that the impact is now minimal. A significant jump there, and only a moderate impact is the next highest level, less than 35%. If we look at passives, it's even better, we see that over 40% say there's no impact at this stage, which is a huge jump, and then the next highest level being minimal. Interestingly, semiconductors has struggled throughout this entire period to provide any meaningful insight. Throughout the period, do not know has typically been the strongest response in this category. It's surprising, something that I will have to study further as we move forward, but participants in the semiconductor supply chain have seemed to have the poorest visibility on their capability in supplying their customers on time. Continuing on, we look at specifically the issue of quarantines and how those have impacted the workforce for the key players. Again, good news here. We see that now 50% say that the impact is only minimal. That's the highest level we've seen in that measure, followed by the next highest level saying it's moderate. So we now have over 85% of the participants in this survey reporting that impacts from quarantines are only minimal to moderate at this stage, which is very encouraging for setting a platform for us to move forward. Now let's take a brief moment and look at concerns about end market demand. Here, as opposed to the other index, the higher number, the better. So again, it goes between 0 to 100 on this index, 50 being neutral. So if it registers 50, it means they expect no change in market demand due to COVID-19. 100 represents a strong increase in demand. 0 means a strong decrease in demand. To some degree, I think there's not a great surprise about some of the measures here. Even before the pandemic, we saw that the automotive industry was struggling. And this is the industry that's had the most difficult time throughout this year. On the other hand, medical equipment has seen strong surges in demand as we've worked to provide a range of personal protective equipment for the healthcare providers, the frontline providers, the hospitals, the doctors. Across the board, the demand for that equipment has shot up, as well as demand, even I would say, for consumer types of medical equipment, as individuals have been monitoring their own personal health. Also, we've seen strong demand for computers and data processing and for telecom infrastructure. Not as surprising, again, given the remote working, telecommuting, learning environment that we've been in. This has placed strong demands for data centers and servers, for the infrastructure equipment to be able to handle the bandwidth that we've needed to support all of these activities that now are taking place online. And once again, the overall average for the first time since the early stages has moved above 50. So we're now seeing a slight increase in expectations for growth in the end market demands. And even in automotive, this is the strongest we've seen since the earliest days of this pandemic in terms of expectations. So very encouraging results as we look at the end market demand. Now, ECIA has been engaged in supporting our members in developing best practices to implement in their companies, whether it's how we work with the manufacturing or factory floors, how we work with the sales environment, how we work with the support functions to protect employees, to protect the workforce. And this is what I call the human version of artificial intelligence, which is, again, we're learning, we're sharing best practices, we're implementing those best practices, and we're seeing some very positive outcomes as we see that now companies, over 80% have now established internal advisory groups to help with prevention policy recommendations moving forward. And we're seeing the expectations in the near term for different groups of employees, how much of their time will be spent working remotely. Not enough time to go into more detail, but the expectation is that many of these workers will continue to work remotely for the long term as well as the near term in this year. This is not just a near term impact, we will see a significant shift in workforce patterns as we move forward. Here, if we look at the growth in revenues, this is an amazingly positive picture. And in March, when people were saying, how do you think this will impact revenues for electronics components? Along with, I would say, everybody else that I saw out there was expecting that if this pandemic lasted as long as it has, that we would see double-digit declines in revenues across the board for electronics components. However, the resilience of this market has been quite amazing. Semiconductors, now this is admittedly driven heavily by memory demand, actually through the first half of 2020 showed a slight increase, which is a big improvement over the strong decline we saw in 2019 in annualized growth. But even if you take memory out of the equation, most of the semiconductor component categories are showing improved performance, with the exception of discrete components. In capacitors, yes, a decline. The passives categories, we've seen declines in capacitors and inductors, but not nearly to the same level, again, that we saw in 2019. And resistors, slight improvement in growth. So whereas we had deep concerns about how this might impact revenues, based on the reporting from World Semiconductor Trade Statistics and World Passive Trade Statistics, we have weathered this extremely well. Continuing on to how we might look at the risk factors moving forward, just to comment briefly what I would consider the most significant areas of concern. First of all, economic confrontations between major powers. If we look at what's been taking place even before the pandemic, this continues to be a great concern. World trade in manufactured goods and free trade agreements have been a major driver of growth in the electronics industry. We need to have that continued strong cooperation around the world. The good news is that the most recent reports are that activity in ports in China and South Korea and in the US has returned to strong levels. And so we're seeing indications that trade is returning to a strong level. Looking at small business health, we have a large number of small businesses that support the electronics industry. Small businesses are those that have suffered the most in this pandemic. And so we need to have this strong infrastructure, this ecosystem that we've created. We need to be able to have a healthy system across the board, including our small businesses. Energy shocks are still a source of concern, and those can be impacted from many different directions. And then finally, we can't ignore the societal and political turmoil that we've been going through. If we look specifically at manufacturer reps, in a survey that was taken in May, we noted that their greatest concern for how this might impact their business would come in 2 to 3 months, which would have landed around August, when they thought it could become quite serious and even severe for these participants, because there's a delay in the impact of their payments and when they will see the impact on their businesses. These are our classic small businesses with our manufacturer reps, and this is an area where we have to pay attention to how well we work and support them between the larger organizations with the OEMs and the distributors. The supply chain, it's an ecosystem. It's been explained before that we have a web. It's not just a single linear flow of components, but we have an ecosystem in play. And this can be at both a strength and also a vulnerability. At any one key node in this web of support goes down, as we learned back in the Thailand floods, the supplier of that 1 cent component can hold up the ability to supply much higher value products. And so we need to be careful in monitoring our supply chains. And I think this is one area where most players are continuing to improve their visibility. And again, looking at the balance sheets of both big and small players, we're likely going to see continued consolidations, but we have to be careful how we pursue those. Looking at the outlooks, good news here, the strongest improvement in operating conditions since January 2019, according to the IHS Markit PMI index. There is the ISM index as well, and other PMI indices from the different Federal Reserve agencies in the US that report on performance. I like personally the IHS Market Index. There's a great level of detail that they're able to provide, but we saw the jump up in recent months in terms of this going above 50, which indicates an expansion in manufacturing production. This is looking at all manufacturing, not just electronics, but I would say electronics following a similar pattern from what I've seen. But we see overall growth supported by expansion in production, a solid rise in new orders. And input buying was modest in September, but firms are expanding their purchasing activity. And supplier delays and the use of stocks in production have led to a renewed contraction in pre-production inventories. So we're seeing that the demand side of the equation could be now moving forward, creating some challenges to meet the demand that we see coming up out there. Let's see, going to the next slide. Now, looking at the overall economy, we've used all kinds of comparisons, primarily from the alphabet, to try and describe how we think this economy might recover. There's been hopes for V-shaped recoveries, and not time to go into discussions of this. You have to be careful when you're looking at these, whether you're looking at actual revenues or whether you're looking at growth rates in terms of what these curves look like. The most recent discussion has been about a W-shaped recovery, which you see illustrated how this might work as people are concerned the economy might stall out in the fourth quarter of this year before returning to some level of growth in the first quarter of 2021. Now, one of the more encouraging scenarios that I've seen came from the Conference Board in their latest outlook. And in their outlook, they gave their most likely scenario, but then they gave an upside scenario, and they gave it a name I found quite compelling, which is the swoosh scenario, where we will see a more modest stalling in the fourth quarter, but a much stronger upturn in 2021. I believe, based on looking at the technologies, the trends, the demands, that the electronics industry could, in likelihood, I believe, see a swoosh scenario play out as we see the continued rollout of 5G technologies, especially IoT technologies, and demand for various types of electronics products that, interestingly enough, will be driven to some degree by what we have learned and experienced through this pandemic. One last comment here before I wrap up this presentation. We have seen a great deal of discussion about the concerns about reliance on imports from Asia, China in particular. We've seen many terms to describe how this might change, from onshoring to my favorite term, which is sure-shoring, bringing components closer to where the actual end product demand and end market demand exists. I will say briefly that even before the pandemic and looking at data, and this only goes through 2019, looking at the data, we were already seeing a significant shift in supply across Asia for electronics components and around the world. We expect, when I do this research again, to see this trend strengthen. And so I do expect to see more of the sure-shoring activities as we've learned from this pandemic, and as players in the supply chain want to have greater confidence in their ability to meet their market demands and to have a stable environment for their businesses. With that, let me wrap up, and we can save some time here for some questions.
Good stuff. Thank you so much, Dale, for the presentation. Obviously, a lot has happened within the supply chain since earlier this year, and the nimble response of industry players has truly demonstrated their amazing resilience, as you put it. Very impressive indeed. Now, part of our proceedings here, as Dale alluded to, we would like to have a scheduled brief Q&A. We want to keep on schedule as well, but I've got a couple here that have come in, Dale. And the first question I read here is, based on your research, if the pandemic should drag on well into 2021 and potentially longer, who stands to become the biggest losers within the electronics ecosystem?
I think that those who would be impacted the most severely would be suppliers from China specifically. I think that that is the case for multiple reasons. One is that logistics continue to be a really challenging situation as we try to get imports coming from China. Now, I'm sure that the situation is different whether you're an individual consumer versus a major OEM. On my own case, I've tried to acquire something from China. It just arrived last week after trying to get it for 6 months due to logistics problems. And so I know that OEMs in China are experiencing severe logistics challenges in supplying their products to the rest of the world. Again, I know there's a difference between an OEM and an individual consumer like me, but I think also the sentiment in this environment, there's growing concerns about the reliance on supplies from China. And there's also growing concerns about even national security risks, as we have seen with regard to Huawei and other players and their ability to supply products, not just to the United States, but to other countries in the European Union, even Germany now looking at pulling back. And so there's been, how should we say, serious damage done to the brand reputation of Chinese OEMs, I would say. And if this continues to go on, the desire to have both, again, a more reliable source of supply and to be able to avoid difficulties could favor more of the domestic OEMs. Now, you don't have replacement scenarios in many areas, and we will continue to be reliant. I'm not saying it will be a divorce between China and the rest of the world, but I do think that the environment will be more challenging if you're trying to supply the rest of the world out of China.
Speaking of China, the next question here, it says you referred to the bounce back experience in Asia. By comparison to the onset of this pandemic, would you say that China, for example, is back to normal with their production capacities or capabilities?
Yes, that's a good question. We team up with another organization that actually does a survey, TPC. They do a survey, and the survey is primarily driven by inputs coming from Asia and China. And they specifically have looked at COVID-19 and its impact. And the most recent survey results have shown that most of the respondents are reporting resumption of relatively normal levels of activity in production of electronics in China and Asia. Much of that driven by their own domestic demand. And that's actually good news. I had an interview with an economist, Cliff Waldman, and we discussed how would an improvement in China's economy, how would that impact the rest of the world? And it's a positive development for the rest of the world. The stronger China's economy is, the better it is for the rest of us. And the most recent reports that I've seen from surveys of players over there show that production levels are back to close to normal levels.
One last question for you from our attendees. Hi, Dale. Your month-to-month statistics reflect change month-to-month, which will undoubtedly be positive with the huge dip we initially saw. What are the actual manufacturing output growth numbers, i.e. actual percentage growth month-to-month?
So looking at, I'm assuming the question is asking how would we compare to the year prior? And that's where on one slide I was showing the growth in the first half of 2020 compared to growth to the revenues growth in the first half of 2020 compared to the first half of 2019. And in semiconductors and in resistors, we're actually seeing growth even in the first half during the toughest period of this crisis. The upturn, if I were to chart the curves, and I have a separate presentation, we have seen all of the curves pretty much in almost every component category turn up in terms of what I call the 312 number, which is the most recent 3 months over the 3 months of the prior year. Almost all of those curves for the various component categories have turned up in terms of their performance. And so, yes, month to month is one way of measuring, but even if we look at this compared to a year ago, we're seeing improving trends.
Very good. Okay, well, looking at the clock and with my objective to keep on track with our schedule, I'm going to conclude this Q&A session and move into our next presentation. Before we do, of course, Dale, I would like to thank you so much, Dale Ford of the ECIA, Chief Analyst there, for his insightful presentation. I think we all learned a lot more about the factors that are directly impacting supply chains today. And we can only hope these numbers continue to improve for everyone in the coming days, months, and the remainder of 2020. Thanks again, Dale. For further information on the association, you can visit their website at www.ecianow.org.